All right, let's listen to this exposition so you kind of get a feel for the way this all works together. Okay, let's talk about a couple more things. So what's the texture of this example? Homophonic. All right. And so we talked about textures last time. In general, the classical period features homophonic textures by far. So just to review, homophonic textures feature one melody supported by harmony. And so, for the most part, the melody is in the right hand, the top voice. Left hand is just giving you harmony. When you alternate in the left hand in a keyboard style on different notes of a harmony, so for instance, when you get to the transition in this example, then there's a term that describes that basic pattern, accompaniment pattern. What's that called when you alternate in a pattern just on a harmony?
Alberti bass.
Yeah, so you should know this term, Alberti bass. And it was a style that arose in the classical period. It's most typically associated with keyboard style writing, but you can also find it in orchestral textures. So this is something that's associated with homophonic textures, and it was really popular in the classical period. So if I give you a work to write an essay about musical style, and this is something that you would see, you identify that this makes use of Alberti bass patterns, and this is something that would indicate a classical style. All right. So in looking at the way that the melodies are constructed, some terms that you'll use in describing melodic construction are the terms conjunct and disjunct. So a melody is conjunct if it has primarily stepwise motion. And the term disjunct is the opposite, that it will feature lots of leaps. So in general, a classical style tends to be more conjunct in melodic construction as compared to a Baroque or a Romantic style. So it tends to be something that is more stepwise, and you can also talk about the range of a melody, the lowest note and the highest note. And so it tends to be more narrow in range, a classical style. Basically, if it's within the interval of a 12th, that's considered to be a narrow range. If it's something that's, bigger than 2 octave, then that would be something that's more extended. And so romantic harmonies tend to be more extended, have a wider range. All right, some other things that you could point out in this are the fact that you don't have lots of performance directions. So you do have a tempo marking, but it basically just says, with spirit. You have general dynamic levels of forte and piano, but you don't have lots of intermediate dynamic indications like mezzo piano or mezzo forte or fortissimo. So one thing that we're going to see in the common practice period is that composers specify more and more performance directions in the score, so that by the 19th century you'll see lots of things that are written into the score by the composer to indicate exactly the way that they want their music presented. So So the Baroque period, we're going to see that there are very few dynamic indications that the composer will notate into the score. So if you look at, the Bach well-tempered clavier, you're not going to have any indication as far as dynamic level, and you won't have tempo markings either. And so there's a lot more that's left to the discretion of the performer in presenting a Baroque work than there is in the Romantic period, where you have much more notation. So Baroque has very few performance directions. So you'll find very few things that have to do with what's legato or staccato, so articulation is very sparse. So few dynamic levels and tempo markings. So classical has a little more. And then the Romantic period is much greater. Okay, and so this kind of goes hand in hand with the idea of improvisation, but it's going in the opposite direction. So in the Baroque period, there's a much greater expectation of improvisation by the performer. So Some examples of this are, first of all, just the way that the Baroque period began, which was with opera and with a monodic texture. So what did monodic texture have to do with? We talked about on Thursday, remember? So something that's monodic features figure bass, exactly. So it features a single melody that's supported by figured bass. The keyboard player would play the bass line with the left hand, and then with the right hand would realize the figured bass, would improvise a chord progression that has good voice leading, that's based on the numbers that are included in the figured bass, the intervals above that bass line. So that's an example of improvisation. So I'll put here a figured bass. The players who would realize that figured bass are a keyboard player and then a second player who would double the bass line. They're called a continuo. Sometimes the term basso continuo is used to describe those players who realize, who perform the figured bass notation. So we'll put here continuo. Another example of improvisation in the Baroque style is the ornamentation of the melodic line. And so there was a wide, big vocabulary of ornamentation that arose in the Baroque period that were symbols that indicated specific ways of decorating the melody. And so composers would indicate that in the score, but then performers would also add their own embellishments. And so one of the styles that arose in the Baroque period was the style that was the predecessor to sonata allegro form. So what was that from the notes on Thursday? What was the predecessor to sonata allegro form? What kind of music was it associated with? Yes. Yes, binary. Yes, binary form. And so in binary form, you have two parts that enclose with double bars and repeats, like we see in this example of Clementi. And the performance practice of the Baroque period was that on the repeat, that the player would embellish the repeat and would add ornamentation. And so that's something that's improvisatory in nature. All right. In the classical period, then you have less improvisation. One thing that happens in the classical period is that the figured bass notation is discontinued, so that by the time you get to Beethoven, it's not used at all. And so it's something that's associated with the Baroque style, the figured bass notation. And instead, all of the parts are written out obbligato. So that term obbligato means that you're obliged to play that. And so we'll put here less improv, and then it was limited more to the cadenzas of concertos. That was still an improvised passage within the concertos, the cadenza. And still, something that was included, like in a keyboard concert, would be a section of the concert where the performer would improvise on a theme that the audience would give them. And so someone like Beethoven was really good at that. So you would say, in general, all the great composers were great improvisers. They could play by ear really well. And it was the improvisations of Beethoven that really made him famous in Vienna in the early 1790s, because they were so powerful and dramatic. All right, by the Romantic period then, even less. All right. So, One of the basic techniques that composers use is this idea of embellishment. If you look at the transition of our example, compare the first two measures with the second two measures in the transition. So we're looking at measures 2 and 3 of the third line with measures 4 and 5. You can see that measures 4 and 5 are an embellishment of measures 2 and 3. You see the left hand's exactly the same. You see that the basic shape of the melody is the same, but it just fills in all the notes with continuous 16th notes. And so that's something that you would point out when you're talking about the way that a composer's articulating, expressing the material. So the basic thing that you do in the development section is to talk about what it is that's being discussed. So at the beginning of the development, what is it that Clementi is discussing? So Kenna, what's happening there at the beginning of the development section? So speak real loud so I can hear you. Yes, so that is developing the B theme. What is it about the B theme that's being developed here? So, same rhythm, right? So it has the same 2 16th note and 8th notes, 4 8th notes. And it has that repeated note, 8th note element too. And so that is directly related to the B theme. What is Clementi doing in the second measure of the development? So how would you talk about that measure in comparison to the first measure?
Sequenced it up?
Yes, so he sequences it up by step. So you should be able to use that term sequence. That's just taking the same pattern, presenting it on a different pitch level. One thing that's associated with sequences that go up by step in a performance practice context is that you play them a little bit louder. That's just a typical thing that a performer will do. You see that Clementi writes that into the music. He wants the performer to do that. But that's just a typical thing that you'll find with that kind of pattern. So he sequences it in the second measure. He sequences it again in the third measure. And then on that last line, then you have more accidentals that are in the music, right? What are the accidentals that you have in the music beginning at that point? So look at the first measure of that last line. Somebody else here. So Ada, tell me, what are the accidentals that are used in that?
Is it a C sharp?
It's a C sharp, and also?
I think that's a B flat.
Yeah, and then we're back to having a B flat. It's in the key signature, but up to that point, we'd had lots of, B naturals because it'd been a C major. So with that, a C sharp and a B flat and everything else are white notes, what key is that going to sound like? D minor, right. And so now the music is modulated to the key of D minor, and it's still kind of working with the B theme, but in the second measure, you can see that he uses a motive that he sequences. How long is the motive in the second measure of that last line that's sequenced? So what's the unit that's being repeated? So, yeah, 4 16th notes. So it's just one beat long. So the unit that's being sequenced at the beginning of development is a measure long. Now you have a sequence of just one beat that's going down by step. And again, you probably will play that with, a diminuendo. All right, that next two measures, that next semi-phrase, is just another version of the first two. So it's just kind of an embellishment of it. At the top of the second page then, you have more sequencing that's going on. So when you hear this, you're going to hear those two measures, the first two measures, second page, that are then sequenced down by step in the next two measures. And it then leads to the second line where you have a G7 harmony, which serves as a 5 of 5. And